Over the last 6 months, I've been writing and speaking about the vitally important topic of Imago Dei education. Imago Dei is Latin for the image of God. I also call it education for image bearers. And this work arose from the need to explain more clearly what we mean at Hope when we say, the hope of Hope Academy is God. The genesis of my thinking about Imago Dei education is really twofold. The first motivation came from trying to understand the bewildering crisis of honor in our country that's crippling our lives from day to day. And the second came from reading a powerful quotation from one of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis, in his magnificent essay called The Weight of Glory. I think we can all agree tonight that we are suffering from a crisis of honor in America that is crippling our day-to-day lives. Think about from the coarseness of our speech on the airwaves and on social media to the cheapening of human life, especially the lives of the unborn, to the unwillingness to even listen to, much less consider the merits of an opposing argument, to the political gridlock that's paralyzing St. Paul and Washington, D.C. What is behind all this? What's changed in our lives? I believe that the wholesale rejection of the doctrine of creation has resulted in a blindness to seeing and honoring the image of God in one another. Whether we realize it or not, we see one another today as less and less human. Mere material beings don't necessarily deserve respect and honor, do they? Random collections of atoms cannot be said to have any ultimate purpose or sense of dignity. And the tragic loss of the image of God in our society has powerfully affected our schools as well. It is no mere coincidence that education divorced from the image of God has relatively quickly deteriorated into the dismissal of God from classrooms, the rejection of truth from textbooks, the discarding of parents, the abuse of teachers, the warehousing of students. It has contributed to school shootings, voluntary segregation, a yawning achievement gap, gender confusion, classroom chaos, and now generation after generation lost to drugs, gangs, and teenage pregnancy. Could the loss of the image of God explain, according to a recent series of articles in the Star Tribune, why black families are fleeing district schools and searching for alternatives in massive numbers? Thankfully, there's hope in God. The solution to a great many of our city's problems lies in our society's recovery of seeing the image of God in one another. Which brings me to that special quote from Lewis's magnificent essay, The Weight of Glory. Listen, Lewis writes, "It may be possible for each of us to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter, but it is hardly possible for him to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. The load or weight or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid daily on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it, and the backs of the proud will be broken. It's a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. To remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long," Lewis said, "we are in some degree helping each other to one or other of these destinations. Remember," he said, "there are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal." Wow. Bearing the burden of my neighbor's glory is easier to say than to practice, isn't it? It's something I've struggled with for a long time. In 1991, my wife Phyllis and I were looking to buy our first home in Minneapolis, and we asked ourselves, if followers of Jesus were called to be the light of the world, what part of our city was most in need of the light of the gospel? Maybe we should move there. Well, everyone in Minneapolis knows there's one neighborhood almost nobody wanted to live in. It's called the Phillips neighborhood, and you're in it right now. And for decades, this neighborhood's been known for two things: extreme poverty and violent crime. Home to 17,000 residents, most of us in the Phillips neighborhood don't own our homes. We rent them. 80% of us rent from month to month, and most of us move several times a year. Half of us in the neighborhood live below the federal poverty level. And in 1996, when over 40 homicides occurred in 1 year, state troopers were sent into the area to patrol our streets. Each Monday morning, I receive an email from Inspector Johnson, commander of the 3rd Precinct, outlining the arrests made during the previous week within a 4-block area around our school. Want to know what happened last week? There were 20 drug arrests, 25 arrests for prostitution, and 3 robbery suspects were arrested. On top of all that, Phillips has the highest concentration of registered sex offenders living in it of any neighborhood in the state. Nobody to say, not in my backyard. And in the last month, there were 3 homicides within a 4-block area of the school. When my father heard that we were buying a house in Phillips, he said, "Russ, you're an idiot." He said, "Everybody knows that you buy a house as an investment. And your investment is going to decrease in value every year. You're going to be paying an annual tax for the privilege of living in Phillips." But against his advice, 26 years ago, we bought our home 3 blocks from here, and we still live in it today. And as our children became school age, my wife and I began to understand that the poverty and crime in our neighborhood had a deeper root. There was an education crisis in our neighborhood of which I was completely ignorant. Very soon, I learned that over half of my neighbors were not going to graduate from high school. Over half. And those neighbors who did graduate from high school would only, on average, be able to read at an 8th grade level. Our state, Minnesota, the education state, I learned had the largest achievement gap between whites and students of color of any state in the country, which meant that my neighbors of color were getting one of the worst educations in the whole country. I learned that the majority of boys who aren't reading books by 3rd grade are probably going to spend some time in prison during their lifetimes. And in 2010, when filmmakers made a documentary about the national urban education crisis, do you know what they called it? Waiting for Superman. Like all parents, my wife and I wanted a great education for our own kids. So what did we do when they became school age? We drove our kids 10 miles across town to attend a great Christian school in the wealthiest neighborhood of the city. This solution created a massive problem for us. We had moved into Phillips to be a light to our neighbors. And we were now forced to ask ourselves another disturbing question. What does it mean to really love your neighbor as yourself? Wanting to justify myself like the expert in the law whom Jesus had just told to love his neighbor, I asked myself, and who is my neighbor? Let me tell you about what life is like for Jasmine, a teenage girl living on my block. Jasmine typically misses 1 or 2 days of school each week, and when she goes to her neighborhood school, she's often exhausted because she's awakened by sirens and gunshots fired around her apartment. She and her mom and her 2 younger brothers moved twice last year. They hardly have any furniture in the apartment, no art on the walls, only a kitchen table and a mattress on the floor. And the few personal things Jasmine has are still in a box from last month's move. Her dad's in prison, and her mom works 2 part-time jobs, one during the graveyard shift. Since her mom sleeps in the morning, Jasmine has to get her brothers up herself and get them ready for school. Sometimes there's no food in the refrigerator or the cupboards, but she and her brothers get breakfast and lunch at school. School's a pretty chaotic place. She says there's fights in the halls almost every day, and her classmates swear at the teachers. But there's nothing ever really done about it. She says that she's offered drugs at school almost every day. Jasmine's not on track to graduate. She doesn't understand what's going on in math class. She hasn't for years. So she doesn't do the homework anymore, but nobody at school seems to really care anyway. Jasmine's struggling with depression. A few years ago, she was sexually abused by an uncle. Jasmine wants to play on the basketball team, but her mom said she can't because she has to take care of her brothers after school. She can't risk even taking them outside to the park to play because it's not safe. She's never been on a family vacation, never even visited suburbs like Woodbury or Eden Prairie, although she's heard about them and wonders what they're like. If she's like most of her friends, Jasmine will probably have a child and drop out of her high school before graduating. Jasmine is our neighbor. So what could it mean to recognize the Imago Dei in Jasmine and love her as I love myself? Every month, a different church or ministry group comes into PV Park here in the Phillips neighborhood and serves a meal to the poor. Can you guess what's always on the menu? I heard somebody say it. It's almost always hot dogs. And to be honest, if I was going to serve my neighbors with an education, it would probably be a hot dog kind of education. Even though none of us wants that kind of school for our own kids. If I want a filet mignon education for my own kids, wouldn't Jesus encourage me to desire that same kind of education for Jasmine? But that kind of love would be so costly, wouldn't it? Like the priest in the Good Samaritan story, for 6 straight years, each morning I put my kids in the back seat of our car and I drove right around my neighbor's children as I took my own kids to school. I often waved to them, and sometimes, even in frustration, I would shoot up a prayer and ask God to tell someone to do something about this problem. And the Lord must have smiled and said, well, there is this one guy, Russ, that I've put there, but he's got 2 big problems. First, he's got a hard head. But you know what's even worse? He's got a hard heart. Looking back, I now see that I sinned against my neighbors by believing 3 specific lies. First, I believed that there was some kind of a cash flow crisis in heaven, and that the maker of heaven and earth certainly couldn't provide the millions of dollars it would take to provide a remarkable school for my neighbors. Second, I believed the lie that the fear of men was of greater value than the approval of God. Lately, I've come to see that I also succumbed to a third lie. The lie that there are different levels or degrees of the image of God in different peoples. At some subconscious level, I justified my indifference to Jasmine's educational needs by believing the lie that my African American, Latino, and Somali neighbors were less deserving of a great education than my own kids. Where did that kind of implicit bias and racialized thinking come from? I had always thought that I believed that all men were created equal. But you know, as a child, different messages were sent to me. Let me tell you a story. For instance, My family lived in the wealthy suburbs outside Milwaukee, but my dad owned a bar and restaurant within the Milwaukee city limits. Often he would put us in his Cadillac and drive the family to the restaurant. And as we passed from a predominantly white part of the city to a predominantly black part, I would always hear a loud click. The sound of the power door locks locking the car. And though we never, ever spoke about this, the implicit message being sent to me was that people here are not like us. The truth of the Imago Dei teaches us that that's a lie. And even though I've walked with God for over 35 years, you know what? I am still repenting of that kind of false thinking. As Martin Luther King famously said, there are no gradations in the image of God. Every man, from the treble white to a bass black, is significant on God's keyboard, precisely because every man is made in the image of God. Well put. So what does Imago Dei education mean for the youth of our city? Let me suggest 8 things. It means, number one, that the miseducation of inner city youth should be one of the most important social justice issues of our day. Number two, it means that one of the best strategies to redeem and transform the inner city is a great school that shapes a generation of wise leaders who love what God loves and hates what God hates. Third, Imago Dei education means that all children are image bearers of God, and so a school for our neighbors has to be a remarkable school, not just an average one. It has to be the kind of school we would want our own children to attend. At my table tonight is my youngest son, Aaron. He was in the very first, second grade class. You think that shaped how the teachers that I hired? You better believe it did. Number 4, Imago Dei education means that because mankind's chief problem is sin, and because Christ is a great savior from sin, school needs to be based on the gospel and on the teachings of Christ. 5, it means that inner city parents shouldn't be ignored, but they need to be deeply involved in the solution, and they have to have some real skin in the game. 6th, Imago Dei education means it's essential to do the really hard work of holding teachers, parents, and students accountable for their responsibilities. 7, it means that results really do matter, and that we have to actually close the achievement gap. And finally, because it's currently against the laws of the state of Minnesota to use taxpayer dollars to provide Imago Dei education to a child, it means that brothers and sisters living outside the neighborhood will need to help bear the burden and partner with inner city families to make this kind of school affordable for everyone. If I had more time, I would tell you about how for years I continued to disobey God's clear call to start Hope Academy. And I would love to tell you how God used my dearest friend, Jeff Bird, to give me the courage to quit my job and to do something crazy like start a school. Little did we know, Jeff, how God would use our little steps of faith then to build a great Christ-centered school for urban youth. A school today serving 485 students from 300 families. Day after day, we're seeing the same group of high poverty, at-risk students beat all the odds and become successful beyond our wildest dreams. Reading the great books, studying Latin and calculus, getting into great colleges, and coming back to this neighborhood to serve our community. Tonight, you're going to hear a wonderful story about the fruit of Imago Dei education in the life of one of our recent graduates, Kimberly Aris, as told by Kimberly and her father, Jerry Rubio. You'll also hear an amazing story of God's redemptive work in Mandy Caldwell's life. As the Lord provides, Our 5-year strategic plan to grow Hope Academy is a faith-filled plan to grow the student body by 60% and serve 275 more inner-city youth with this remarkable education. Of course, each student will need a sponsor in order to come. Maybe some of you will feel called to join us in bearing the weight of our neighbor's glory. If so, we invite you to join with hundreds of us as friends and help us change the world. The image of God, it changed my mind, it changed my heart, and it will change the Phillips neighborhood and the world. Thank you for listening.